Hey there, YouTube. I'm Yukitsu. This is Yukitsu Times. Welcome to my channel. Welcome to a Tuesday talk show. So, yet again, do apologize for having been absent for a little while there. Again, December does tend to kick my ass just a little bit, but we're back and we're trying to catch up just a little bit with what we're doing. And today I thought, why not talk a little bit about anime, because that's something that I like. Now, I do have to put a few disclaimers at the start of this. First of all, there will be spoilers for what we're talking about, so if you're the sort of person who hasn't seen what we're talking about, do go ahead and watch that beforehand if you're interested. The next thing I want to talk about is that I am not necessarily the most fanatical expert on anime or manga. I watch things that I've heard about substantially and things that pique my interest. I'm not the sort of person who binge watches every single thing every season, or even some seasons I don't even watch anything, honestly speaking. And generally speaking, I'll watch something only after it's completed, after other people have talked about it, after they've analyzed it and discussed whether or not it's worth watching. So, my actual repertoire of things that I've seen is relatively limited, and this is because there's certain things that I like in shows, and I'll be discussing how I got into anime and why that's the case for me in a different video. But for now, I want to do sort of compare and contrast. That will allow you to sort of understand my taste in anime just a little bit as we go forward with this series and Tuesday talk shows and talking about anime sporadically. We'll be talking, of course, about other things like games and D&D and stuff like that as well. But today we're going to be talking a little bit about Code Geass and Death Note. And this is a side-by-side comparison about them, and there's actually so much that I have to talk about in regards to these that I'm going to be talking about just one aspect of these for today's episode, and that is the characters. So in this particular case, I'm also going to be upfront in saying that I like Code Geass more than I like Death Note. And there is nothing wrong at all with preferring Death Note over Code Geass. I think that there are going to be plenty of people who think that the very bright color palette in Code Geass, sort of very over-the-top robot actions, just takes away from the sort of core of the sort of intellectual, sort of realistic, grounded sort of ideas that are in Death Note. They're very different series in many ways, despite the sort of many similarities in terms of theme and structure and plot. And I think that because of this, they're easy to compare and contrast. There's so many things that are different, there are so many things that are the same, that generally speaking, if you do like one, you can get something out of the other. But I think that if you do like one, you're probably not going to actually necessarily like the other. I don't know too many people who actually like both. But of course, I don't know too many people on a personal level anyway. So anyway, let's delve into this topic just a little bit here. So let's start off by talking about Death Note and its characters, and one of the sort of major flaws with Death Note as a series in terms of why I don't like it as much. Now, Death Note has lots of characters with no real development, personality, or defining traits or features to them, and that's perfectly fine. These are background characters. They're not meant to be elaborated upon. They're not necessarily in the limelight enough for you to actually care about them as individuals. And this stretches for a large amount of their cast. There's only a small core that you're actually supposed to care about that has developed personalities, that has little quirks to them, that gives you a better understanding of who they are as people, and gives you a more than superficial glance at their motivations and their ideas and their ideals. And those are the ones that you sort of can focus on. It's fine for a series to have characters in the background that have no elaboration whatsoever, no personality whatsoever. They're just there to sort of fulfill a plot function. They sort of walk in the background with their newspaper, and then you forget about them. But let's talk a little bit about their core cast and why I think there's certain problems with the way that they're all represented. So first of all, we can talk a little bit about Light himself. Light as a character does not really appear in the series. And this is sort of the way I take from this. There's two instances where we have Light as a character. The very beginning, just before he gets the Death Note, which lasts for very, very little time. And there's a brief interlude where he loses all of his memories of having the Death Note, of being Kira, and of having Death Note powers, in sort of a gigantic sort of ruse to make it so that he's got a clear alibi for events that are happening within the story. And this is Light Yagami as a character that is displayed throughout very, very short segments of the story as a whole. Now, we get very brief glimpses of him, who he would be without the Death Note, what his ideals are, what his aspirations are, what he believes in. He clearly believes that Kira is in the wrong when he himself isn't the one who has the power to kill people. But when we flip things around and turn him into Kira, he turns into a completely different character pretty much immediately. And it's the fact that there's no sort of development towards becoming this sort of amoral to completely immoral sociopath that we see as the protagonist of Death Note that makes it kind of an uninteresting arc, because he doesn't have one. He is either Light for very brief moments, or he's Kira, and there's no sort of in-between. There's no development into becoming Kira. There's no sort of growth of him as a person. There's no sort of compromise of his morals that slowly degrades him into becoming one thing or another. And there's no sort of questioning what he's doing as wrong or right. He simply believes inherently that what he's doing is right, and simply based around the fact that he's got the power to do so. And when he doesn't have the power to do so, he seems to ethically believe that he's in the wrong. So he doesn't have any defining set of beliefs or morals as a character. He simply has the ability to do something, and he does it when he can. And if he doesn't have that ability, he's opposed to it. So we can sort of say that maybe he's a very selfish, self-centered person. It's hard to say who he is as a real person, because you get so few glimpses of that, because he's so contradicted by who he actually becomes. Is it that he secretly always wishes that he could have killed people with a whim, even before he had the Death Note? If that was the case, maybe that it just is the way he actually is deep down inside, even though he doesn't articulate that or act upon that when he doesn't have the Death Note. But I'm not sure that that's what they're supposed to have you believe in when you observe him. There's certain shades of this that could have been more interesting if they had delved deeper into it. The sort of main reason that the character is the way he is sort of a riff on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, sure, but I think even more so, it's more of a reflection on the Ring of Gyges. And I think if they sort of went a bit deeper into the ideas and the concepts of that, it would have been a bit more interesting. But they don't necessarily do more than skim superficially at these ideas, and ultimately it leaves you feeling like they could have done so much more with the series. And these characters are ones that are brimming with potential, but I don't think that potential was ever actually tapped into, and to such a high degree that I don't think they even tried to really tap into them. Ultimately, what makes these characters interesting is the same sort of dynamic as watching a duel. You're only really interested in it for the drama of watching one character trying to outwit or outplay another one, but that in and of itself is all that there is that's substantive in the story. It's what is the move that this player is going to use, what's the move that this player is going to use, who's going to come out on top because of it, how are they going to react to this new situation that they've been put in. It's a little bit like watching a chess game when you don't know who the players are, because the players themselves are wholly uninteresting, in my opinion. Now, well, that's not entirely true. Let's get into L, the next character along the line here. L as a character is interesting to watch. He's fun to observe. He doesn't really grow or develop as a character. He's an interesting parallel to Light, because he does run completely parallel to him as a character. He has all the same traits as him. He's incredibly brilliant. He's eccentric to a certain degree. He doesn't really care about justice, even though he pretends to. Ultimately, what he's more interested in is winning, and proving that his worldview and his methodology or his intellect is right, and winning over, in particular, Kira in this particular case. And this is why I'm saying this is more like a duel than it is anything else. That's where sort of all the drama comes down from. It doesn't come from the character. It doesn't come from anything. It comes from one person trying to win against another. And despite that, he's got enough quirks and enough interesting elements to him that make him stand out, that he's fun to watch. Like, he's not necessarily a multi-dimensional character. He doesn't have an interesting story arc where he changes throughout it or has an epiphany about something. He just sort of does his thing until he gets killed, again, spoilers, and gets replaced by an identical version of L 2.0, which we can call Nier. So there's no real development to this character. There's no real structure to this character other than he's designed to be a parallel, and that he is designed to be quirky and interesting and fun to watch, and entertaining. But he's not a deep character. He doesn't really allow us to get a better view of the game that's being played between them. He's just interesting for his own sake, for the little quirks of personality. And I think that ultimately it really did suck that he was as killed off at the midpoint of the series. I think that he was one of the more fun parts of the story, even though he wasn't necessarily growing as a character, even though he wasn't necessarily that interesting from a character perspective even. He was just sort of quirky and fun to watch. The other characters that we can get into are people like Misha, I guess. She kind of is irritating since she feels like she lacks any sort of agency of her own. She has some level of motivation for why she does what she does, but ultimately she just sort of feels like a plot device at times in quite a few moments, or some sort of tool that Light can use to further his own particular goals and aims. I don't necessarily think that that's a very interesting role for a character to play. And again, she doesn't really develop as a character. I think that the writer of Death Note is particularly bad at making characters sort of grow or develop or change or have challenges to their worldview presented to them. And there's no sort of backpedaling on this particular character either. She is exactly that sort of character. Other characters would be sort of Ryuk. He's just sort of a passive observer. Again, he's a little bit like L. He's fun to watch. He's entertaining. Him eating apples, I guess, is a little bit of a quirky thing. He's got lots of personality quirks, but he doesn't have a lot of personality beyond those sort of superficial things that he does or says that would let you sort of get a deeper glimpse into his worldview or what he actually cares about or what he wants. Ultimately, he's just bored, I guess, and he's a passive observer of something that he finds interesting, which in this case happens to be light. And that works fine as a character, but he doesn't really contribute necessarily all that much because of that dynamic. He's not really that important to the story, even as a part of that dynamic, other than as a means of getting exposition from time to time. There aren't really that many other characters that are standout or that important in the series, and you'll notice that of these characters that I've already mentioned, very few of them are interesting from a character perspective, from their own perspective. And that's because this isn't a character-driven story. And ultimately, I think that's fine to a certain degree, but they certainly could have done a better job of making some of them either empathetic or interesting or entertaining, or even grow as characters. And even though this is ultimately just a duels between two individuals are interesting because you're rooting for one of the players in that, or you're rooting against one of them, or because you know the backstory of them. The actual duel itself is rarely as interesting, and even then, you often want to have sort of an ideological conflict between them. None of that's necessary, but it adds a lot to the story, and since that's really absent here, I find, it's not necessarily as interesting as it really could be. Okay, so let's move on to the characters of Code Geass. So these ones are the primary difference between them, despite the fact that there's big plot elements that can be ripped from one straight into the other, including the sort of central one, the most sort of primal, basic analysis of each of these being the same sort of story about a young man getting supernatural powers and imposing his will into the world via those powers. The characters are what makes this so different, where the main character and the antagonist of Death Note were completely in parallel with each other. They both ran in the same direction, and they both were sort of exact looks of... They were identical to each other. They were completely the same. Everything about the main character and his primary antagonist in Code Geass is flipped, where Lelouch is highly intelligent, his main antagonist, and I'm going to say that Suzaku is his main antagonist. Well, yes, the sort of final boss that he has to defeat is the Britannian Empire's emperor, Charles. Ultimately, the person who most often opposes him is Suzaku, who represents everything that he's not. Where Lelouch is smart, Suzaku's kind of dumb. Where Lelouch is incredibly weak as a human being, Suzaku is incredibly physically fit and a great combatant. Where Lelouch is Britannian of high nobility. Well, actually, I guess Suzaku actually also is quite high up in the hierarchy as well from his native Japan, but he's been cast low because of the situation where he's now just a commoner. Where Lelouch is working with the Japanese rebellion to overthrow the Britannians, Suzaku is working with the Britannian government. They're opposite in virtually every single way, except for a single intersecting point. And that is that both of them want to change the Britannian Empire. Their goal is what is actually the same. And this is so opposite to the way that they treat their characters in Death Note. The characters are so in sync with each other that, in terms of their ultimate goal, that they end up, by the very end of things, cooperating to some extent with one another. the difference between them is ideological. The reason that they're opposed to each other constantly, the reason that the end of season 1 climax was so interesting, is because of the ideological differences between them. Suzaku believes that revolution will do nothing but bring harm to the people of both countries and cause countless needless deaths and suffering. Lelouch believes that there's no way to abolish a rotten system without the fires of revolution. And because of this, they're constantly sort of clashing with each other throughout the series, even before Suzaku knows that Lelouch is his antagonist, is his opposite. And these sort of dynamics make the sort of struggle between them a lot more interesting, since they can't do the same techniques against one another in the same way that Light and L have to do the same things. Both of them are trying to outwit and outthink the other, whereas in Code Geass, that's not how things are working. Lelouch often has these very finely crafted, intricate plans, whereas Suzaku just suddenly comes in and starts wrecking everything because he's that good a fighter, destroying his sort of machinations and plans in the process. And that makes for a much more interesting dynamic to a certain extent, in my opinion. And while I do appreciate a sort of duel between two hyper-intelligent people that happens in one of these sort of side characters, it's much more interesting, I think, to see the sort of inherent drama and personal stakes that are at play with Lelouch and Suzaku. One of the other main things about Lelouch is that he's a more complex character than Light, and I'm going to say that is an absolute fact. It's not one of those things that's debatable or up for interpretation. He has multiple different things that he believes in, and he's got multiple different goals that he's got going at any given time, and some of these conflict with each other, and this is what causes sort of an internal sense of drama for him. He could have made his life so much easier for himself if he had just killed off Suzaku or commanded him to be his follower or something like that. But instead, what he ends up doing, actually, is commanding Suzaku to live because he values his friends. In fact, like his main antagonist, his main rival, is his best friend, which creates its own sort of sense of that sort of drama to it. And I think that this is what makes him so strong as an individual character. He doesn't have a singular, only one goal that he's striving for constantly. Yes, he does have the main goal of trying to overthrow the Britannian Empire, but people aren't that simple usually. They don't have only one thing they want in life. And it's the sort of forcing him to sort of choose compromises. He could have taken the easy path, like I think Light does. Light, I would say, is a character who simply takes the easy path because he doesn't have multiple complex goals or ideals. He simply has the one that he wants to accomplish. He wants to win the fight. He wants to be Kira. He wants to kill off all the criminals. That's only really realistically one goal. He doesn't care about any individual person. They're all just sort of pawns or tools or puppets to him. Whereas to Lelouch, he's got a whole set of different priorities and ideas and ideals. I think to a certain extent he doesn't really care about reforming Britannian society. I think that, well, yeah, that's something that he does want to do. I don't think that that's his main driving impetus. I think to a certain degree he doesn't really care about the Japanese in particular. And while I think he is sympathetic to them, if he lived somewhere else, he would certainly probably think about someone else rather than helping the Japanese. I think that to a certain extent what he really cares for is, for one thing, I think he's out for revenge against a society that had harmed him greatly in the past. I think to a certain degree he's more motivated by his sister Nunnally and the fact that he wants to give her a sort of safe environment to live in, one where there's none of that sort of royal backstabbing that had taken the life of his mother and crippled his sister prior to the events of the story. I think that that's a stronger motivator for him. I think him maintaining the friends that he holds and values, there are certain episodes where the people that he knows and affiliates with are having some sort of problem or another, or they get killed, and he's devastated by those moments. He does not want to see his friends or his family, well, plenty of his family he wants to see dead, but he doesn't want to see the people nearest to him getting hurt. And he does a lot that he could have just ignored to sort of avoid that problem. So he's very much someone who has many different things that he has to sort of choose between and compromise, and we constantly see him giving up on his main goal, or making his main goal so much harder for himself, because he's unwilling to compromise on ultimately what his ideals are, his core center as a person, what he believes in as a person, and what he prioritizes as a person. He's not willing to discard all those different things to get to his ultimate goal. And I think you could say that in some ways he wants it all. He's a little bit selfish in that way, but when those things are things that I think are noble and worth fighting for, it makes him a much more interesting and dynamic character. And because of this, there's a lot more to the tension and drama in the moments, because there's so much more at stake. And it's not simply a case of, like with Light, in any given scenario, you know what his ultimate goal in that scenario is going to be. It's kill the person who's in his way. It doesn't matter if it's something, like, you can't threaten him with anything really other than his own life, because the only thing that he cares about is himself. He doesn't care about anything else at all. So if, there was some drama where he had to choose between one thing or another, he'll always choose the one that advances his goals as Kira. No sweat. He doesn't care at all. He's a sociopath. That's not really the case with Lelouch, where you've now got the drama of him potentially going to lose just because his plot doesn't work. You've got him having to decide between two different things that he could potentially do, and you've got the sort of push and pull and internal struggles that he has in coping with and dealing with the decisions that he's made, hurting the people around him sometimes in ways that he didn't necessarily expect, which I think makes for a much more interesting character development arc for him, because he does undergo changes as the story goes on. Certain things wear him down, break him down, make him question what he's doing. There are moments where he gives up on his ideas of revolution because someone does convince him that it is truly possible to find a peaceful resolution to the problem, and shows that they're making steps towards that. But when that gets dashed to the ground, he's forced to go back to his initial sort of thesis. There's no one else willing to sort of side with him in a peaceful way, so he has to go back to the sort of way that he had intended to originally. There's sort of lots of different moments where it shows that he's willing to compromise, he's willing to bend with his worldview a little bit, if it will get him what he wants without the sort of violence, without hurting the people he cares about. But ultimately, he sort of achieves his goals through a lot of struggle and hardship, because he's not willing to simply just go through things the easy way. And I think that just made it a much more interesting series because of it. By contrast, we can look at other characters, Suzaku in particular. He's similar. He sort of has this naive belief at the beginning that you can always accomplish something within the system by sort of cooperating and not really stirring the pot. You can sort of get the Japanese people the respect that they deserve, and even if not liberty, equal rights within the Britannian Empire or something like that. And he becomes a sort of model citizen because of this, and believes that by working with them, he'll eventually pave a way forward. But that sort of naive outlook gets dashed over and over and over again, as it's shown constantly that there's these atrocities being committed, and that the Empire is unwilling to sort of bend towards his favor, and that they're only really willing to sort of give him their favor because of his talents as a pilot. And I think that to a certain extent, maybe he could have achieved his goals, but not within his lifetime. So I think that he sort of becomes a little bit more jaded towards that idea by the very end of things. And there are certain other characters that are similar in a lot of ways to L in Death Note. A lot of Code Geass characters are just simple. They don't really change very much throughout the story. They've got no real arc, and they're just kind of quirky and fun to watch. The scientist Lloyd is one of my favorite characters, just because he's interesting to watch. Like, he's fun to watch, he's entertaining, he's got a great voice actor, but he doesn't really change very much. He doesn't have very much contribution to the story. He's just there to be entertaining and interesting and fun. He's a side character, he's a background character, and I think that they do a really good job, though, of making the background characters enjoyable and more entertaining and interesting to watch than they were in Death Note, by and large. I mean, we're talking about a very, very minor side character that I think has pretty much zero plot significance to the story, being just as entertaining to me as one of the main characters of Death Note. So I think that just goes to speak volumes about the difference in characterization between these two series. And ultimately, it's that sort of effort in making the characters more dynamic and interesting and having multi-layered beliefs, or at least being fun to watch, that really pulls Code Geass ahead. And there's an argument to be made that the characters in Code Geass are a little bit more caricature, and that's true. They're more colorful and they're more exaggerated personalities, whereas the ones in Death Note are meant to be very serious, somber people who act the same way all the time because it's more grounded in reality, and that really is what real people are like. But I think that despite that, it's still fiction. Even in fictional stories that are meant to be realistic, you've got exaggerated characters and characteristics. For example, Agatha Christie novels,